Hi everyone, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. An Indian man takes the fall for crimes committed by the world's richest person. But despite 61 British ministers petitioning on this man's behalf, pleading his innocence, the American judicial system refuses to let this man go. So let's get into the story of Chris Maharaj. So the story that I'm going to tell you today takes us to different parts of the world. It starts in Trinidad and Tobago and then takes us to the UK and then eventually takes us to the USA. And it involves an Indian family. The story starts in the early part of the 20th century with Dolly Maharaj and her husband Nanan Maharaj. The family derived their lineage from indentured slaves. The Maharaj family had three children. The first one was their son named Krishna, who was born in the year 1939. And Krishna was followed by a girl called Indra in the year 1943, and both of these children were followed by another son who they named Ramesh in the year 1945. This whole Nanan family traced its lineage to indentured slavery, and indentured slaves were basically poor Indian people who were forced to move by the British or sometimes voluntarily moved because they had no other choice. Um, they were moved by the British primarily towards the Caribbean islands to work as labor. The Indian indentured slavery, especially towards the in Trinidad and Tobago, started around the year 1945 and definitively ended around the year 1917. The Nanan family or the Maharaj family ran a grocery store in a village called Diamond Village and gave credit on interest to other poor Indian families in addition to selling them groceries. Now, these other poor Indian families lived in the barrack system in the village, and compared to many other people around them, the Maharaj family was still better off. The three siblings were extremely hardworking, as were their parents, and these three siblings not only studied in Trinidad and Tobago, but eventually went to England to study. Chris, the eldest, in fact, became a businessman and then became quite a famous businessman, and he started his own fruit business. The second son, Ramesh, studied law and eventually not only became a lawyer, but in fact became the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago. And Indra herself, a very educated woman for the times that she was born in, she ended up marrying the most famous lawyer of Trinidad and Tobago, a man who was also a representative in the parliament later in life from a region called Siberia in the second independent parliament. Now, these three children grew up in a primarily Hindu household, but later in life it seems like all three of them converted to Presbyterian Christianity. Now, out of all these three siblings that I just spoke about, I'm going to focus my story on the eldest, Krishna Maharaj. Now, Krishna moved to England in 1960 and he started calling himself Chris. And he started out not only as a student but also started working as a truck driver. And he would regularly make really long trips from the southern tip of England to the northern tip of England, and he would go back and forth. And by doing all this, he managed to launch a successful import and export business in fruits. He took out a small loan to import and sell his first load of bananas. And from here, he built a flourishing business, and he took his profits and he reinvested them time and time again. He then started diversifying his business and expanded his operations, and he traded in tropical fruits, which eventually led him to a place like Florida. But before moving to Florida, Chris Maharaj actually got married in England and he even divorced his first wife and then ended up marrying again to a woman called Marita. But before moving all the way to Florida, Chris Maharaj's enterprises had made him an extremely wealthy man. He invested his wealth in everything from Rolls Royces to racehorses. Chris was in fact known to be extremely generous, not only towards his own family, because he ended up settling his younger sister Indra. He also helped Ramesh settle down. He was also very generous with all his friends. Chris was basically always throwing lavish get togethers, and people of all sorts would come and attend that, especially the creme de la creme of society. In the mid 1980s, Chris and Marita began to escape the frigid British winters and started staying more and more in Florida. This is where Chris further wanted to grow his business. So by the year 1986, Chris Maharaj was doing quite well even in the US. He was in fact doing so well that by now he had become a part owner of a newspaper and he had started investing in other fruit importing business. Chris Maharaj wanted to grow his business even more and had a business meeting scheduled at the DuPont Plaza Hotel on the morning of 16th of October of 1986. Now, the DuPont Plaza Hotel is located in downtown Miami, and the hotel was not considered to be an upscale establishment. This hotel, in fact, had a bit of a reputation for being the location of many sort of shady kind of dealings. Chris's meeting was not arranged by him. He had actually asked an acquaintance, a man called Neville Butler, to arrange this meeting for him. As I mentioned, among Chris's several business ventures was a newspaper that he partly owned and operated, a newspaper called the Caribbean Times that catered primarily to the West Indian community in New York. And in fact, this paper is still in circulation even today, and it's now available as an e-newspaper. So Neville Butler was the man who was going to facilitate this meeting. This man, Neville Butler, was a contributing writer for the Caribbean Times as well as for a similar competitor newspaper called the Caribbean Echo. Both of these publications had recently run a series of articles detailing a financial feud between the owner Chris Maharaj and one of his former business associates, a man called Derek Moo Young. Derek was a Chinese Jamaican businessman, and like Chris Maharaj, Derek too was ostensibly running a small import-export fruit business. He had also convinced Chris Maharaj to let him manage all the properties that Chris wanted, especially in and around Florida, but all over the United States. And Chris agreed to do this because Chris was partly living in Florida, but he was also partly living in London. But in all these dealings with Chris Maharaj, Derek Moo Young apparently had failed to meet his obligations and had even made off with thousands of dollars. According to Neville Butler, the man who arranged this meeting at the DuPont Hotel, this meeting was arranged because Chris Maharaj really wanted to meet Derek Moo Young because Chris truly believed that Derek Moo Young had scammed him, had extorted him, and had also extorted his relatives back in Trinidad and Tobago, and not only of some money but hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some newspapers even put that as around $60,000. Now, just if you calculate that for 2025, that would come to about $500,000. Now, let's go a little bit into the history of this man called Derek Moo Young. Now, on the day of the meeting, Derek Moo Young brought along another person with him, and that was his son called Dwayne Moo Young. So, as I mentioned earlier, Derek Moo Young was a businessman who lived primarily in Florida in a place called Davie, Florida, and he left his homeland of Jamaica in the year 1977. He came to the US to start a new life, and then later on brought his entire family to the US, and they all became citizens of the country in the year 1982. Now, Dwayne Moo Young was actually the youngest child to be born to Derek Moo Young and his wife Jeanette Moo Young. Dwayne Moo Young had graduated from Barry University with a bachelor's in business administration in the year 1983. So, on the day of the meeting, which was 16th of October of 1986, the son Dwayne Moo Young was actually accompanying the father Derek Moo Young because he really wanted to observe how his father did business and he wanted to learn something from him. So the meeting was set, and the meeting was set in DuPont Hotel in Miami. Now that I've given you a brief overview of the Moo Youngs, I've given you a brief overview of Chris Maharaj, Neville Butler, I've also told you a little bit about this shady hotel, let me add one more layer of detail here, which is the city of Miami. Now, a brief overview of the city of Miami in and around the 1980s would tell you that Miami City was actually the hub of criminal activity and was completely wrought with drug smuggling activities of the Colombian drug cartels. Murders related to the drug trade were extremely common, and what really drives this point home is the fact that Miami police, their homicide unit, had to deal with so many bodies every single day that they purchased a special refrigerated truck just so that they could pick up these bodies from different roads around Miami. The city of Miami in the 1980s gained notoriety as the drug gateway, acting as the first port of entry where all the drug cartels were bringing their different drugs into the United States from South America. Among these cartels were the famous cartels. Among these cartels was Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel, and in particular, this particular cartel, Pablo Escobar's cartel, had transported billions of dollars worth of cocaine every single year through the 1980s. Roughly 1 dozen Colombian crime families collectively controlled the entire cocaine trade, and they soon amassed fortunes which was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, inching towards billions of dollars per family. In all this chaos, though, the violence on the streets of Miami grew every single day, and the problem spread throughout the 1980s. In fact, nearly 10% of Miami police at one point in the 1980s was either fired or suspended because they were all suspected of being part of the drug cartels. The corruption was extremely rampant in the police station, and this was an open secret. Right, so now that we have all this background, now let's get into this particular day, and let me draw your attention back to October 16 of 1986. And let's get back to the DuPont Hotel, which was in downtown Miami. And more specifically, let's go into room number 1215. Now, this was the room where a man called Eddie Dames had booked this particular room, which was room 1215. Sometime around the noon, a maid at the DuPont Plaza Hotel was asked by her boss to go and check on room number 1215. And initially, when she tries to walk into this room, it seems like it's locked. So she sort of tries to move it. And she has a master key which does not seem to be working, which only means, of course, that someone was already inside. That's why she couldn't use it. So the room appeared to be occupied at this point. So this woman sort of leaves. So this woman one more time tries to jiggle the door open, and this time the room is slightly ajar and the room actually opens. So what she notices is that there is a do not disturb sign which is hanging on the inside of the door. The minute she sees that, she thinks that the room is okay for cleaning, so she goes and gets her supplies, and then she returns 10 minutes later. The maid returns with the security guard, and this time she notices that the do not disturb sign, which 10 minutes ago which was hanging on the inside, it seems this time it's hanging on the outside. And she is successfully able to use her master key, and she unlocks the door. The minute she steps into the room, the maid discovers one deceased body, one deceased man apparently lying right next to the door. So the police is quickly called, and the detective on the scene, the first one to arrive, is a man called Detective Birdmaster of the Miami Police Department. He identifies the victims one by one, and he sees the first victim was which was a man called Derek Moo Young, and then later discovers his 23-year-old son, Dwayne Moo Young. On his initial walkthrough, Detective Birdmaster observes that there is blood which seems to have seeped through the carpet on room number 1215. It seems like there is blood near the hallway. It seems that the blood had also entered the adjacent room, because this was a suite and it apparently had 2 bedrooms inside it. And it seems like the adjacent room, the doorway of the adjacent room also had a projectile, and a fragment of that had embedded itself into the doorway. Upon entering the room, he found Derek Moo Young laying inside the entrance of the other room, and he sees that there are multiple gunshot wounds towards his leg. He notices multiple gunshot wounds in Derek's legs and his chest. And right next to him, there's a floor. On the floor, there is a sofa cushion which appears to have been used during the attack, and it seems like this was, of course, used to muffle the sound of gunfire. The detectives and later the crime scene analysts sees that there are blood stains on the doorway, and it seems like there is a blood stain with a whole hand imprint on it. A briefcase is seen right next to one of the dead bodies, which seems to contain some sort of documents which must have belonged to one of the victims. There was a bedroom on the second floor of the suite, and that's where they find the son, Dwayne Moo Young, and he seems to have fallen on the ground when he was kneeling, it seemed. While the police was still investigating the crime scene, they have a stroke of good luck, and all of a sudden, an eyewitness to the whole murder comes forward. This acquaintance, this eyewitness happened to be a person very close to Chris Maharaj, the man who had arranged the meeting between Chris Maharaj and Derek Muyang, the man himself, Neville Butler. So Neville Butler comes forward and tells the police that he had seen the entire thing go down and he knew for sure that Chris Maharaj was the culprit. At first, Neville Butler claimed that Chris had abducted Neville Butler and had forced him to assist Chris Maharaj in killing the Muyangs. Later on, he changed his story a little bit, but then he still said that Chris had done the whole thing. And it was on the basis of Neville Butler's story that Chris Maharaj was very soon arrested. When he's arrested by the police, he is asked to come in for questioning. When he's arrested by the police, Chris Maharaj immediately tells the police that he had indeed met both the Muyangs on that day, and he had that meeting and shortly thereafter he left. Chris Maharaj even said that he had been gone for hours before Chris told the police that he had in fact met both the Muyangs on that day, and shortly after a very brief meeting he left. He alleged that he had already been gone for hours by the time the Muyangs were killed. Neville had taken Chris to the room at around 9 in the morning and he explained that Neville Butler had convinced Chris Maharaj, so he's telling the story, had basically said that why don't you meet this man called Eddie Dames as well in room 1215, and that man, Eddie Dames, will be the one who could help you distribute your newspapers throughout the Caribbeans and in the Bahamas. And the reason was that Eddie Dames was in fact working as an air traffic controller, and it would be very smooth functioning and he would be able to help you in the business. So that's what had happened there. This is what Chris Maharaj claims when the police picks him up. Chris Maharaj claimed that Eddie Dames was supposed to show up, never showed up for that meeting, so Neville Butler took Chris Maharaj into the DuPont Plaza Hotel and they waited for the Muyangs to show up in room 1215. Now the story changes a little bit, and this is now from the point of view of Neville Butler. Neville later tells the police that in fact Derek Muyang unexpectedly on that particular day turns up with his son. The son was never the target, only the father was the target. And when the Muyangs entered the room, Chris Maharaj suddenly emerges behind the door. He's already holding a gun in his right hand and a pillow in his left hand. He says that an argument broke out between Derek Muyang and Chris Maharaj, and in a fit of anger, Chris Maharaj shot at Derek Muyang. He then ordered Neville Butler, who was the acquaintance who had basically arranged the whole meeting, to tie up both Derek Muyang and the son Dwayne Muyang, and Neville Butler had no choice but to comply, so he complied, and then Derek lunged towards Chris unexpectedly, and at that time Chris lost it and he fired 3 bullets towards Derek. And another version of the story, Neville Butler says that Chris was in fact interrogating Derek Muyang about the money Derek had allegedly extorted from Chris's relatives back in Trinidad and Tobago, and Derek managed to crawl towards the hallway as he was being interrogated, and that's when Chris lost it and pulled him back into the room and shot him. So these are different versions of the story that Neville Butler is relaying to the police. Then Neville Butler tells the police that after killing the father, Derek Muyang, Chris then took Dwayne Muyang upstairs for further questioning. He was trying to verify what Derek Muyang had done with that money, and he thought that the son would already know that, so he drags the son upstairs. Shortly after, Neville Butler heard a single gunshot, and then Chris returned downstairs all alone, and then Neville Butler and Chris Maharaj both leave room 1215. Neville and Chris then, for some reason, did not flee the entire area. They actually stayed back after killing both the Muyangs, and they were in their car in the parking lot of the hotel, and they stayed back so that they could even take care of Eddie Dames. Now, Eddie, remember, had never even met Chris beforehand. And somehow, Eddie Dames had also been dragged into this plan to kill the Muyangs in the hotel room. But in his different versions of the story, Neville Butler really does not ever explain why Eddie Dames was part of this whole thing. So Neville Butler gives these different versions of the story to the police. So later on October 16th, or quite early on October 17th, Chris Maharaj apparently calls up Neville Butler and arranges a meeting with him at a Denny's restaurant near Miami airport. And he apparently called Neville Butler up so that they could both align their stories. Now, Neville Butler relays this entire information to the police, and when Neville Butler finally arrives at the Denny's restaurant, he's not alone, and he's accompanied by Detective Birdmaster and a lot of police force of the Miami police. And that's when they arrest Chris Maharaj for the murder of both the Moyoungs, Derek and Dwayne. In a later interview, when Chris was asked about this whole scenario, he said, quote, "I was having dinner at Denny's when I saw Neville Butler walk in with a man. The man pulled out a card and said, 'I am Detective Birdmaster. You're under arrest for murder.' I said, 'What are you talking about?' Unquote." So Chris Maharaj gets quickly arrested and he's taken to the court. Now, for some reason, despite being a millionaire who was potentially facing the death sentence for the killing of Derek Moyoung and Dwayne Moyoung, Chris Maharaj apparently maybe underestimated the strength of the case against him. So he hires a single defense attorney and pays him just $20,000 for the whole trial. This case quickly becomes worse than you can imagine. The judge in this case attempts to solicit a bribe from Chris Maharaj in exchange for his freedom. Chris apparently refused to give the judge any kind of bribe, which is such an absurd thing, and immediately reports this whole thing to the police. So 3 days later, the judge in this case gets arrested by an undercover officer who was posing as a Colombian drug cartel member, and he apparently gives the judge a bribe, and the judge gladly accepts it. Of course, this whole thing is captured on camera, and the judge is then removed from the courtroom and later disbarred on the 4th day of the trial for accepting bribes. Now, you would think this is a win-win. This would mean if you have a corrupt judge, you will quickly get out of this case. But unfortunately, that's not what happened here. Despite having the judge disbarred, for some reason, Chris's defense attorney did not ask for the case to be set aside. So Chris's attorney did not ask for a mistrial at all. That's the simplest thing he could have done, and he didn't do that. Next, neither the prosecution nor the defense attorney tell the jury that Chris Maharaj had actually passed a lie detector test. However, their principal prosecution witness, the man Neville Butler, had in fact failed the lie detector test. At this point, Chris's attorney, Eric Hendren, should have taken the opportunity to ask for a mistrial. And to Chris's utter confusion and everyone's bafflement who's listening to this story right now, for some reason he didn't do that. I think even as a junior attorney, everybody around us, we all know this, right? So Neville Butler then takes the stand against Chris Maharaj, and he is the one and only eyewitness, apparently, of the whole thing, and it's on his word that Chris is already in jail. So Neville Butler takes the stand, and now he starts to detail in front of the jury how Chris Maharaj carried out all the murders. He tells the jury that Chris was holding a gun in one hand and pillow in the other hand. Detective Birdmaster also testified in this case, and he tells the jury that Chris was questioned by the police and asked, "Did you ever enter room 1215?" And Detective Birdmaster says that Chris says that he never entered the room, but we found his fingerprints inside the room. He also tells the jury that Chris's fingerprints were also found on the "Do Not Disturb" sign and in 11 other locations throughout the room. Detective Birdmaster and the prosecution side, they even present a ballistic evidence identified as a Smith & Wesson 9mm handgun as the main murder weapon. And this is the kind of gun that Chris had purchased and 6 months before the killing, and they present that as evidence that Chris had definitely killed both the Muyangs. Now, this would not surprise you if you've heard the story so far, that Detective Birdmaster also tells the jury that upon being asked, "Do you own a gun?" Chris Maharaj said, "No, I do not own a gun." And this, of course, damaged his credibility in the whole case. So, the final blow from the side of the prosecution, the state, was that they mounted one more witness, a man called Tino Getz. Now, initially, Tino Getz had actually told the police that he was with Chris Maharaj at around the times of the murder. So, of course, Chris could not be in two places at one time. And that's the reason Tino was a really good witness for the defense team. Unfortunately, what happens is that Tino switches sides and then testifies for the prosecution instead. Tino Getz was a journalist for a Miami-based Caribbean newspaper. Tino, in fact, just like Neville Butler, seems to have written a lot of articles about the feud between Chris Maharaj and the Muyangs. And Tino had originally told the police that at the time of the killings of the Muyang, Tino was actually with Chris Maharaj, and both of them were drinking beer around the time when the maid says that she was entering the room. This means that Chris Maharaj was miles and miles away from the DuPont Plaza Hotel, which is in downtown Miami. And as a matter of fact, they were initially, Tino Getz said that they were both together. And actually, they were having a drink together in Fort Lauderdale at the time of the crime. But after a while, on the stand, Tino testifies against Chris Maharaj and says that Chris Maharaj had attempted several times to kill the Muyangs, and they had together had several practice runs. Then one more thing Tino does, which completely screws up the defense's case, is Tino gets up on the stand and says that the 5 people who are testifying for Chris Maharaj, and they're saying that that Chris Maharaj is innocent, are actually, all these people are unreliable witnesses. And why are they unreliable? Well, that's because I bribed them. I told them that you should say this. So, because this one man gets up, the 5 other people who testify on Chris's behalf are not taken seriously. Now, rather than mounting a vigorous defense for Chris Maharaj, for some reason, Chris's defense attorney, Eric Hendren, simply stands up in the court and rests his case without calling a single witness from the defense's side. The prosecution version of the events went completely unchallenged, and Chris's attorney, Eric Hendren's cross-examination of Neville Butler was so weak. Eric Hendren's cross-examination of the main witness, Neville Butler, was so weak that he did not even ask Neville Butler about the stupid claims that he was making. For example, Neville Butler went on the stand and initially said, well, Chris had killed the Muyangs because of the monetary issue, right? Because apparently the Muyang, at least the father, had absconded with a lot of money of Chris Maharaj and his family. So that was the first reason. Another really absurd reason which was presented by the prosecution was that Neville Butler says that Chris Maharaj really wanted to kill the Muyangs because he wanted to boost his newspaper sales, which was the Caribbean Echo. So, of course, after such a disastrous representation by Eric Hendren, Chris Maharaj, of course, was found guilty in this case. And the minute he heard that he had been found guilty, he in fact collapsed in the court. He had to he had to be picked up by 2 people, and he was completely unconscious, so he was taken out of the court in that unconscious state. When Chris Maharaj was later interviewed about his guilty verdict, he said, quote, "When they found me guilty, I passed out. I fainted. I just couldn't believe you could be convicted of doing something you didn't do. Murder, it's like dying, if you know what I mean. It's like another death," unquote. That's what Chris said a little bit later when he started contacting newspapers, and he basically wanted to tell people about the injustice that had happened to him. Over the next several years, Chris Maharaj's appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court, and even the US Supreme Court. But all his appeals were denied. In the year 1994, which was 7 years after Chris Maharaj had already been on death row, a London-based civil rights attorney, Clive Stafford Smith, began investigating this case. And that's when, for the first time, Clive Smith obtained a full police file and discovered a huge wealth of previously undiscovered information. And he was very easily able to see a lot of contradictory evidence. So in a later interview, the lawyer Clive Stafford Smith says, quote, "I started going through it and I found that the police knew that Chris had lost his gun before the murders even happened." Clive explained, "I started going through it and found that the police knew the entire time that Chris had lost his gun before the murders even happened." In the same interview, he later says, "I also found that Chris had told them about from the very beginning that he was in fact in room 1215 and he had met both the Moo Youngs. So there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why his fingerprints were there," unquote. In fact, handwritten notes from the police case, which Clive Stafford Smith was able to get into when he started investigating this case, clearly show in handwritten memos that the police already knew that Chris's gun had gone missing months before the Moo Youngs were killed. And as a matter of fact, Chris's gun was found months before the actual murders by a Florida Highway Patrol officer, and he confiscated Chris's gun and some of Chris's money at a traffic stop. So the entire time the prosecution was claiming that Chris had killed both the Moo Youngs with a particular 9mm gun, and the entire time the gun was actually with the police. Further records casted severe doubt. Further records of Neville Butler's background showed that he had a severe lack of credibility. While the trial judge had been told that both Neville and Chris had passed the polygraph test, this was in fact false information. Neville had actually failed many parts of his lie detector tests, and there were some parts of the lie detector test that showed inconclusive results. This story of Neville Butler's had changed time and time again, and he had failed at least 2 polygraph tests. In complete contrast, Chris Maharaj has actually passed his test, but the judge was never even told all this. Armed with this new evidence against prosecutorial misconduct and for suppression of exculpatory evidence, Clive Stafford Smith filed a new appeal on Chris's behalf. Clive Stafford Smith also argued that Chris's original lawyer, Chris Hendren, had failed in his job as a defense lawyer. He also said that the prosecutor at the time, John Christianix, had engaged in extremely unethical tactics and conducts, and that's the only reason why Chris Maharaj was found guilty in this crime. However, even after listening to all this new evidence, the state insisted that Chris Maharaj's original attorney, Eric Hendren, was a competent legal representative, and they refused to listen to any of the new evidence that was uncovered, and Chris's conviction remained intact. So Chris's death sentence, after a few years of all this evidence coming out and the defense side mounting so much evidence, Chris's death sentence was overturned, and his punishment was converted to a 50-year prison sentence, which was not a relief because that would mean that Chris Maharaj would be eligible to go for his first parole hearing after he was 100 years old. Clive Stafford Smith, which was the new civil rights attorney who Chris had hired, also discovered several other troubling details. The second trial judge had not even written the sentencing of Chris Maharaj himself. Instead, he had requested that the prosecutor in the case draft the entire thing for him, and he simply signed it. In fact, the document was dated even before the day of the sentencing. So that's how deep the whole cover-up is. Another overlooked piece of evidence was the Moo Young's briefcase. You remember I told you that around the father, Derek Moo Young, they had found a briefcase in room number 1215. While Clive Stafford Smith was working on Chris's defense, he asked to see the contents of that briefcase. when he was asking these questions, the district attorney who had originally prosecuted Chris Maharaj in this case kept saying that there was nothing of value inside that suitcase. Years and years after fighting for this, they later tracked down that that was actually not true. There were some really important pieces of evidence inside that suitcase which was lying right next to the victim. Those papers actually revealed that the Moo Youngs, especially the father, we're not sure about the son, but we're sure about the father, revealed that Derek Moo Young was in fact involved in a massive money laundering operation, and inside that briefcase were letters which detailed his negotiation for a purchase of an entire bank, a Panamanian bank, for $600 million. Documents later revealed that Derek Moo Young, despite somehow reporting only an income of $24,000 a year, somehow had access to billions and billions of Japanese yen. In fact, he had over 5 billion Japanese yen. He and his associates, I'm talking about Derek Moo Young, the victim, he and his associates had established a company called Cargill International in Panama, and they were moving those funds for an extremely powerful person. In fact, it seems that they were linked to one of the lawyers who was associated with Pablo Escobar's Medellin drug cartel. Escobar, who was the head of the Medellin cartel, was in the 1980s the most notorious drug lord in the entire world. He was known as the king of cocaine, and he built an entire empire which was worth billions of dollars. His operation thrived on bribery and extreme violence, and he preferred to eliminating his threats altogether. It seems, just with a rough estimate, that Pablo Escobar was responsible for the killing and countless murders of all his rivals, police officers, informants, drug officials, and civilians. The contents inside Derek Moo Young's briefcase strongly indicate that he was involved in organized crime and that he was also somehow linked to the Medellin cartel, which was run by Pablo Escobar. Upon closer examination, duplicate versions of financial documents were found, and some of these documents had forged signatures on them. These papers seem to suggest that Derek Moo Young and his son Dwayne Moo Young might have been involved in laundering money and skimming 1% of what they were receiving from these drug cartels. Now, even 1% of those drug cartel, even 1% of that drug cartel money amounted to millions of dollars. So, in fact, the Medellin cartel had a clear motive to eliminate a man like Derek Moo Young. Another critical detail was the presence of a man called Jamie Vallejo Mejia, who was staying in the same hotel, the DuPont Plaza Hotel, just across from room number 1215. He had been staying in room 1214, in fact, for months before the killings of the Moo Youngs. Blood stains from the crime scene led directly into room number 1214. And despite speaking to the police on that day, somehow Detective Birdmaster and all the detectives on this case gave Jamie Vallejo Mejia a clean chit, despite knowing the fact that Vallejo Mejia was in fact one of the enforcers of Pablo Escobar. Before Chris Maharaj's trial in the year 1987, Mejia was indicted in Miami for laundering money. He was accused of personally transporting over $40 million to Swiss bank accounts on behalf of Colombian drug traffickers. However, he fled the US after making a deal with federal authorities, and investigators later tracked down Jamie Vallejo Mejia in Colombia, where locals identified him as a high-ranking cartel member who was closely associated with Pablo Escobar. Over the years, Chris Maharaj's defense team pursued multiple appeals, all of which were rejected one after the other, to find supporting evidence for Chris Maharaj's innocence and for the theory that it's in fact the Colombian cartels who got the Moo Youngs murdered and not Chris Maharaj. Chris's investigators and his new lawyer Clive Stafford Smith traveled to Colombia several times. They eventually obtained statements from multiple drug cartel members, including one of Pablo Escobar's top lieutenants. They individually confirmed that Pablo Escobar himself had ordered the Muyang murders because the Muyangs had stolen from him. According to the cartel informants, the Muyangs had been set up to be killed at the DuPont Plaza Hotel. Chris, who was supposed to be in the same location at this time, was framed for the murder. The two men who were the actual killers was a man called El Chino, who was an extremely feared cartel assassin, and another man called Emmanuel Guillermo Salazar. This man was also known to be an enforcer of Pablo Escobar. Salazar had previously coordinated the assassination of another federal informant, a man called Barry Seal, in Louisiana, and was in Miami when the Muyangs were murdered. A witness testified that two men resembling the assassins, so one of the assassins was a man called Salazar, the other was a man called El Chino. So these two people were basically, a witness later testified they had seen two men resembling these two assassins entering the hotel with a man called Eddie Dames on the morning of the killings of the Muyangs. Eddie Dames, who was supposedly a newspaper distributor who also worked as an air traffic controller, was later found to be deeply involved in drug smuggling operations all through Colombia. Chris Maharaj's defense investigators believed that the killers waited in room number 1214 on October 16th of 1987 before executing the Muyangs in room number 1215. Neville Butler, who was a key witness against Chris Maharaj, was maybe forced or maybe willingly blamed Chris Maharaj for both the killings. And after compiling hundreds of pages of this evidence, Chris Maharaj's legal team pushed for a new trial, which included the testimony of a CIA informant who had overheard the cartel members discussing the murders around the time when the Muyangs were killed. In 2014, one of Pablo Escobar's former hitmen, a man called Popeye, provided a sworn affidavit saying that it was the cartel who was responsible for the killings of the Muyangs, not Chris Maharaj. Further investigation also exposed inconsistencies in the original trial. For example, so if you remember, I mentioned a man called Tino Getz earlier. He was a key witness for Chris Maharaj early on, and then he switched sides. Chris's team later found that this man was promised leniency in several other criminal cases in exchange for his testimony. So he was a tainted witness. Meanwhile, the 5 other alibi witnesses who stood with Chris Maharaj and said that he had never murdered the Muyangs because he was with them at the time of the killings, those testimonies were actually never included, and those people stood by their statements even in 2014. Despite all this mounting evidence of the innocence of Chris Maharaj, he remained imprisoned. In 2019, so remember, he was arrested in 1987. Now we are talking about the year 2019. In 2019, federal judge Alicia M. Rice ruled that Chris had provided, quote, clear and convincing evidence of his innocence. However, she also determined that this was not enough to secure his release. The US legal system, based on a 1983 Supreme Court ruling, does not guarantee the right to freedom even if innocence is proven after conviction. Having spent around 35 years behind bars, much of this time on death row, Chris's health significantly deteriorated. Now, of course, as consumers of true crime, you already know if someone's on death row, they're usually let out only for 1 hour per day. So Chris's health significantly deteriorated in the 35 years in which he was locked up in a box. His wife Marita continued to visit him regularly, hoping that they would reunite one day and hopefully they will be able to go back to the frigid winters of London. British officials, including the members of parliament, advocated for the release of Chris Maharaj several times, but of course everyone was unsuccessful. Despite this overwhelming evidence supporting Chris Maharaj's innocence, his appeals were denied time and time again. In March 2022, the 11th Circuit Court rejected his latest legal challenge. The court refused to consider crucial arguments regarding Jamie Vallejo Mejia's role in the crime and declined to address Chris Maharaj's claims that he was wrongfully convicted. While legal efforts from his defense side were persisting one day after another, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, Chris remained behind bars. He was a man who was wrongfully convicted, and he was hoping that the last few years of his life he would at least be out of captivity. Unfortunately, Chris Maharaj took his last breath in captivity and died not too long ago on 5th of August of 2024 at the age of 85. It's only then that his body was finally let go from the US and he was flown back to the UK by his wife Marita. His funeral was conducted on 27th of August of 2024 in West Bay. Chris Maharaj's obituary was written by his defense attorney who was a civil rights lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith. And in very moving words, he writes about the life that Chris led inside the American prison system. He says, quote, "My friend Chris Maharaj, who has died at the age of 85 in a prison hospital in Florida, was a British victim of an American miscarriage of justice. Chris enjoyed life as a wealthy London businessman until the year 1986, when he was framed for the murder of Jamaican man Derek Moo Young, who was managing his property investments for him in Florida. Unknown to Chris Maharaj, Moo Young was involved with the Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar and had embezzled close to $500,000 from Chris to cover the money he had failed. It's a long obituary, so I'll now come to... I read you the beginning of the obituary, and now I'll now come to the end of the obituary. He later on goes on to write about his friend and his client Chris Maharaj and says, Chris had been trusting to a fault. It was this feature of his personality that led to a tragedy. He placed his faith in the Moo Youngs to manage his property investments in Florida with a view of spending time with Marita during the British winters. Both the Moo Youngs' criminal activities entangled Chris Maharaj in a terrible web from which he could not escape. He is survived by Marita and by 5 children. Indrani from his first marriage, Christina and Christopher from his second marriage, and Tanya from another relationship that he had before he ever met Marita. So that brings us to the end of this extremely sad case of a wrongful conviction of someone who was trapped in the judicial system despite the judicial system knowing that this was an innocent man. Let me know your thoughts about this case, and until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.